Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are diving deep into one of mythology's most enduring and troubling tales, a story about the origin of human suffering, the price of knowledge, and the fragile thread of hope that sustains us through darkness. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's explore the myth of Pandora's box, a narrative that has resonated across 2,500 years because it speaks to something fundamental about the human condition, about curiosity and consequence, about how a single moment of transgression can reshape the entire world. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Your presence here in this moment connects us across the darkness of the night, just as it did for the ancient Greeks, who would gather to hear these stories whispered around fires that flickered like the very flame Prometheus stole from the gods for them. This is a story about fire and defiance, about revenge and punishment, about the cost of rebellion against those who rule. But before we meet Pandora herself, before we see the moment when curiosity overwhelms restraint, we must first understand the world into which she would be born and the anger of the god who sent her. The ancient Greeks, those philosophers and poets and thinkers who crafted the Western world's foundations, had different ages of humanity. The poet Hesiod, writing around 700 years before the birth of Christ, composed a didactic poem called The Works and Days, a text meant to teach moral lessons alongside practical wisdom for living. It is in this text, more than any other, that Pandora emerges fully formed and fully terrible, not as a woman of flesh and blood, but as a punishment incarnate, a gift wrapped in malice, designed specifically by Zeus, king of all gods, to bring suffering and sorrow upon all mankind. But before Pandora, there was the Golden Age, that mythical time when mortals lived like gods themselves. They did not toil, did not hunger, did not grow old or weak. The earth gave forth her bounty without coaxing. Fruit hung heavy on trees that bore all seasons. Grain grew wild in fields that knew no plough. These mortals experienced no sickness, no pain, no grief or conflict of any kind. When their time came to die, it was as gentle as falling asleep, and their spirits became the spirits of guardians, benevolent forces that protected the living and watched over justice and peace. It was a world unmarred by knowledge of mortality, untouched by consequence, innocent in a way that would soon seem impossibly distant. This was the world that would end with the opening of a jar. This was the paradise that would shatter because of curiosity, because of a woman who could not resist looking at what was hidden, and because a god had orchestrated the entire catastrophe long before, from the moment he claimed his throne. That god was Zeus, and he ruled not through wisdom alone, though he possessed that in abundance, but through will and vengeance and careful, calculating judgment. Zeus was a god who kept score. He remembered every slight, every trick, every act of defiance. And there was one being who had dared not just to defy him, but to trick him, not once but twice, and who would soon face a punishment so terrible that it would echo through eternity. His name was Prometheus, and the consequence of his actions would reshape human existence forever. Prometheus was a titan, one of the elder gods who had ruled before Zeus, and the Olympians seized power in that great war that tore the cosmos apart. But unlike his brothers, Atlas, who was condemned to hold the sky upon his shoulders for eternity, bearing a burden that would never lift, or Menoetius, who was struck down by the thunderbolt itself, Prometheus had chosen wisely during that conflict. With his brother Epimetheus, he had sided with Zeus. His name meant forethinker, one who sees ahead. And indeed, he possessed a gift that few others possessed: the ability to see the future, to know what was coming before it came. Through his prophetic sight, he understood that Zeus would emerge victorious from the war of the Titans. He knew which way the storm would break, which side would stand, and which would fall. He made his choice accordingly, calculating that loyalty to the rising power would serve him better than clinging to the old order that was already crumbling. For this strategic foresight and his loyalty, when the war ended and the Titans were defeated, Prometheus and Epimetheus were spared the terrible punishment of Tartarus, that deepest pit where the defeated Titans groaned eternally in chains, their bones pressed against stone, their voices swallowed by an abyss from which no echo returned. Instead, Zeus gave the two brothers a task. They were to be the craftsmen of creation in a certain sense, responsible for distributing the qualities, the gifts, the abilities among all the creatures that inhabited the world. Epimetheus took the lead in this great work, and his name, Afterthought, proved prophetic to his nature and destiny. As he moved through creation, he gave each animal something. To the lion, he gave strength and sharp claws that could tear through hide and sinew. To the bird, he gave wings and the freedom of the sky, the ability to soar above all other creatures. To the fish, he gave fins and gills and the ability to breathe beneath the waves, turning the vast oceans into their domain. To the rabbit, he gave speed to flee the hunter. To the porcupine, he gave quills like armor for defense. To the horse, he gave endurance and strength. One by one, every creature received something, some quality that allowed it to survive in the world, to find its place in the hierarchy of creation. But Epimetheus, lacking the foresight his brother possessed, failed to plan ahead. His nature was to see only what was immediately before him, to understand only after the fact what should have been understood beforehand. As he moved through creation, giving away the gifts with abandon, he did not pause to consider what would remain. By the time he had finished with all the beasts and birds and creatures of the earth and sea, he found his stores depleted. There was nothing left. And then he came to mankind, that final creation, and he realized what he had done. Man was created naked, defenseless, clawless, and fangless, lacking even fur or feathers or wings or any of the gifts that the other creatures possessed. How would this creature survive? How would it endure in a world full of predators who had been given strength and speed and armor? It was then that Prometheus stepped in, and this moment would alter everything. He could not bear to see humanity left defenseless, left stripped of the means to survive, left vulnerable to every threat. His heart moved with something that went beyond his nature as a Titan, beyond his duty to Zeus. Something like compassion, or perhaps it was defiance, or perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that humanity had potential, that mankind could become something more if given the tools. And so he acted. He took action that would set him against the king of the gods. He entered the workshops of the gods, the great forges where divine things were made, where the very fabric of creation was crafted and shaped. And he stole. He stole the mechanical arts from Hephaestus, that god of fire and the forge, the craftsman whose hands could shape anything, who could make wonders from raw materials. He stole wisdom and practical knowledge from Athena, the grey-eyed goddess who understood strategy and craft and how things ought to be done. He stole the ability to use reason and to plan, to look ahead as he himself did, to imagine a future and work toward it. He stole from many, taking gifts that were meant to remain the province of the gods alone. And then, most crucially, most dangerously, he stole fire itself. He crept into the sacred places where fire burned eternally, the flames that no mortal was meant to touch. And he hid the fire in a hollow fennel stalk, that peculiar plant with a woody center that could hold fire and protect it from discovery. He carried it carefully, hidden from the sight of Zeus, whose eagle eyes could see all that transpired in his dominion. He brought it down from Olympus, down from the high places where the gods dwelt, down to the mortals who waited in darkness and cold. With fire came transformation, came the beginning of everything that would define humanity. Fire meant warmth against the cold of night, meant the ability to survive in winter, meant security and comfort. Fire meant the ability to cook food, making it more nourishing and easier to digest, easier for the body to absorb and use. Fire meant the possibility of working metal, of heating ore until it could be shaped into useful forms, tools and weapons and ornaments. From that single theft, from that one act of defiance, civilization itself would grow. Man developed rapidly. He built shelters, structures that could protect him from the elements. He created weapons to hunt and to defend himself against predators and against other men. He learned to forge metal into useful shapes, to shape wood and stone. He began to control his environment rather than merely surviving within it. He began to dominate the natural world. Where once he had been prey, hunted and vulnerable, he became the apex predator, the master of all he surveyed. Technology began to develop. Art began to emerge. Culture began to take shape. Language grew more sophisticated. All of this was possible because Prometheus had looked upon helpless humanity and chosen to defy the king of gods to help them. But Zeus discovered the theft. His eagle eyes, those instruments of divine power that could see all that transpired in his dominion, spotted the smoke rising from mortal fires. He realized what Prometheus had done, and before we speak of how Zeus punished the Titan for this transgression, we must understand why this act enraged him so profoundly. It was not simply that Zeus was concerned about mankind being elevated, about mortals gaining knowledge and capability. There was something more personal here, something that cut deeper into the divine pride. Prometheus had already demonstrated his willingness to deceive Zeus, his willingness to trick the king of gods himself. There was an earlier incident at a place called Mythology, a location sacred to the gods, where all gods and all mortals had gathered for a great sacrificial feast. Prometheus had been tasked with dividing a bull between the gods and men, deciding what each party would receive going forward, establishing the pattern that would define the relationship between divine and mortal for all time. He made 2 portions. One was wrapped in white fat, looking appetizing and rich, filled with meat. The other was bones wrapped in fat, looking equally good on the outside, but containing nothing of value underneath, nothing that could nourish. Prometheus presented these 2 options to Zeus, saying that the god must choose which portion the gods would receive in future sacrifices. Zeus, who knows all things and sees all things, was not fooled. He understood immediately what Prometheus had done, understood that he had been presented with a choice between 2 deceptions, that whichever he chose, he would be getting the worse end of the bargain. But Zeus chose the bones anyway. He took the lesser portion deliberately, accepting the apparent trick. This established the pattern of sacrifice that would continue from that time forward. Mortals would keep the meat for themselves and burn only bones and fat as offerings to the gods. This was an act of supreme divine wisdom, a way of maintaining the proper order and yet being generous to mankind. But it was also a demonstration that Prometheus had successfully deceived Zeus, that Prometheus had outmaneuvered the king of gods at least this once. This deception, this theft of status and respect from the gods, was what truly bothered Zeus. And then, after this already existing sin, after this demonstration that Prometheus could not be trusted, Prometheus stole fire itself. It was not merely the theft that enraged Zeus, it was the defiance. It was the suggestion that mankind, mere mortals, deserved better treatment than the gods saw fit to give them. It was the implication that Prometheus, a titan, had the right to make decisions that contradicted Zeus's will. It was rebellion, pure and simple, and Zeus could not allow such rebellion to go unpunished. Yet Prometheus knew something that would protect him, at least partially. Through his gift of foresight, he possessed knowledge of a secret that terrified Zeus. He knew that Zeus would one day father a child with a mortal woman, and that child would be destined to overthrow him, just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus, just as Cronus had overthrown Uranus before him. The prophecy ran through the divine bloodline like a curse, each generation being replaced by the next, each father being cast down by his son. Prometheus knew the identity of the woman who would bear this fated son, and he kept this knowledge to himself like a secret weapon. As long as Zeus did not know which woman would bear his doom, Zeus could not prevent the prophecy from coming true. But more importantly, as long as Zeus did not know which woman to fear, he would need to keep Prometheus alive. For Zeus would eventually need to extract this knowledge from the Titan, and that would require keeping him alive and under his power. This knowledge of the future, this understanding of his own doom, would become Prometheus's only shield against complete destruction. If Prometheus was the embodiment of looking ahead, of seeing consequences before they unfolded, of perfect foresight, then his brother Epimetheus was his perfect opposite, the embodiment of hindsight, of understanding only after the fact, of failing to anticipate what was coming. Yet Epimetheus was not a fool exactly. He was capable and competent in his own right. He could perform complex tasks. He had successfully distributed gifts to all creatures, but he lacked that crucial ability to think ahead, to ask the question that would have changed everything. What comes next? What will remain for those who come after? He could not reason forward through the consequences of his actions before he took them. Epimetheus had proven this when he and his brother distributed the gifts to all creatures. Epimetheus had worked diligently, enthusiastically even, adorning each animal with some quality that would aid its survival. He had given carefully, thoughtfully, but he had not planned ahead. He had not preserved anything for mankind. When Prometheus had to step in and supplement humanity's gifts, it was because Epimetheus had not thought far enough forward to ensure that no creature would be left unequipped, that something would remain for the final creation. So it was fitting, in the way of mythological justice, that Epimetheus would later play a crucial role in Pandora's arrival, in the unfolding of Zeus's revenge. For his very nature, his inability to look ahead, to sense danger, to anticipate consequences, would make him the perfect victim for the trap that Zeus was setting. Prometheus, foreseeing what was coming, understanding through his prophetic gift that Zeus would exact a terrible price for the theft of fire, knew that he needed to warn his brother. The punishment would be severe. He did not know exactly what form it would take, but his knowledge of the future showed him darkness and suffering approaching like a storm. And so he warned Epimetheus. He told his brother, clearly and directly, "Do not accept any gifts from Zeus. Do not bring into our home anything that the King of Gods offers to you. Whatever he sends, refuse it. Turn it away. Nothing good can come from accepting gifts from one we have wronged. It was not a subtle warning. It was not a suggestion open to interpretation. It was as clear as warnings can be, as direct and powerful as one being could be with another. And Epimetheus, at that moment, heard the words and perhaps even understood them on an intellectual level. But understanding and heeding are not the same thing. Understanding is passive, something that happens to you. Heeding requires an act of will, a commitment to follow through on what one knows to be true. And Epimetheus had a weakness that would prove his undoing, just as it would prove the undoing of all mankind in general. He could not resist beauty, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that he could not imagine that something so beautiful, so perfect, could be dangerous. He lacked the foresight to understand that beauty could be weaponized, that perfection could be a mask for malice. For Zeus, in his infinite cunning and his vast knowledge of how to wound, did send a gift. But it was not a package or a treasure or a weapon that could be easily put away. It was a person, a woman, the first woman in fact. Her name was Pandora, and she was beautiful beyond measure. But before we speak of her beauty, before we attempt to describe the physical perfection that her creators had combined to give her, we must speak of how she was made, because her creation tells us everything about Zeus's intentions, about the nature of punishment in the eyes of the gods, and about the deep misogyny that ran through ancient Greek culture and thought. Pandora's creation was not the work of one god, but many. Zeus, in his vindictiveness, in his desire to involve others in his revenge, summoned other gods and goddesses to participate in her crafting. Perhaps he wanted witnesses to the act. Perhaps he wanted each of them to feel complicit in what was to come, to make them understand that this punishment was not merely Zeus's whim, but a collective act of divine will. Or perhaps there is a deeper symbolism here, that Pandora, as the first woman and the source of human suffering, was fashioned with the cooperation of the entire divine hierarchy, that all the gods had a hand in her creation. Whatever the reason, the assembly of gods came together in Zeus's presence, and each contributed something to her making. First came Hephaestus, the god of the forge, the divine blacksmith who worked in fires that burned hotter than anything mortal fire could achieve. Hephaestus was known throughout the cosmos for his skill, for his ability to take raw materials and shape them into things of surpassing beauty and functionality. He was the one who had forged Zeus's thunderbolt, that weapon of supreme power that could command respect from gods and mortals alike. He had created the armor of Achilles, which would make the greatest warrior of Troy nearly invulnerable, allowing him to stride across battlefields as if he were more god than man. He had created wonders that seemed impossible, things that should not have been able to exist. He could work wonders with metal and flame, transforming the raw and the rough into the perfect and the powerful. But for this task, Zeus commanded him to use a different medium. He was to take clay, common earth from the ground, the same material from which all life springs, and sculpt it into the form of a woman, the first woman to ever exist. And Hephaestus, though he may have questioned the purpose, obeyed. He is a god bound by duty and by the hierarchy of Olympus. He molded the clay with his divine hands, shaping it with the same care and attention to detail that he brought to his greatest works. His hands moved across the form, smoothing and shaping, creating proportions that were perfect in every way. The features were delicate and lovely, with a face that could launch 1,000 ships, with eyes that seemed to hold mysteries. When he was finished, it was not merely a statue, not simply a representation of beauty. It was something that appeared alive, something that seemed as though it might at any moment open its eyes and draw breath. The form Hephaestus created was so perfect that it transcended the merely beautiful and entered into something sacred, something almost divine. But Hephaestus's work was only the beginning. For Zeus next summoned Athena, the goddess of wisdom, the virgin warrior born from Zeus's own skull, in a scene of miraculous and unprecedented birth. Athena was known for her practical wisdom, her ability to think strategically, to see the best way forward in complex situations. She was also the patroness of crafts, the one who guided human hands in the creation of beautiful and useful things. She taught men how to weave cloth, how to work wood, how to make the tools that civilization requires. Athena came to the clay form that Hephaestus had sculpted, and she adorned it. She clothed it in a shimmering robe of silver and white, a garment of such fineness and beauty that it seemed to shimmer like moonlight on water, like the glow of stars reflected in a still lake. She wove garlands of flowers to grace the figure's hair, fresh flowers that never withered, that remained eternally in bloom, an impossibility made manifest through divine power. She placed upon the figure's head a golden crown, wrought by Hephaestus's own hands, so intricate and detailed that it showed scenes of creatures from the earth and sea, so finely crafted that the animals depicted seemed almost to move and live as you looked at them. But Athena gave her more than mere garments and adornment, more than physical beauty. She gave her practical gifts, the kinds of gifts that matter in the everyday world. She gave her skill, the ability to work wool and flax, to take raw fibers and transform them into cloth of surpassing quality, cloth that would last and endure. She gave her the knowledge of how to weave, the patterns and techniques that allow one to create something lasting from something fragile. She gave her knowledge, practical wisdom, the sort of understanding that allows a woman to manage a household, to know what must be done and when it must be done, the wisdom of organization and care. Athena's gifts were not flashy or immediately obvious to the untrained eye, but they were fundamental, crucial, essential. They were the gifts of competence and capability, the kind of gifts that enable someone to actually function in the world. Next came Hermes, the messenger god, the swift-footed trickster, the one who moved between worlds, between gods and mortals, between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. Hermes was known for many things: his speed, his cleverness, his role as a guide and messenger. But he was also known for something darker, something that made him dangerous and unpredictable. He was known for his silver tongue, his ability to persuade, to convince, to speak in ways that swayed the hearts and minds of others, that made them want to believe what he was saying. But he was also known for his cunning, his willingness to lie without remorse, his ability to deceive without feeling guilt or shame. He was a trickster in the truest sense, a being who found joy in cleverness and deception, who played tricks for their own sake. On Zeus's orders, Hermes gave these qualities to Pandora. He placed within her a mind that was clever, but also deceitful, that could frame a lie in such a way that it sounded like absolute truth, that could make falsehood seem more convincing than reality. He gave her eloquent speech, a voice that was beautiful to hear, that had a musical quality to it, that was pleasant and soothing to listen to. But he gave her this voice so that she could use it to manipulate and persuade, so that she could convince others to do her bidding. He gave her the nature of one who could cheat without feeling guilt, who could steal without conscience, who could transgress and break rules without any sense of wrongdoing. He gave her the soul of a trickster, someone who could move through the world without being caught, who could bend others to her will through cleverness and deception. Then came Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, a being born from sea foam and desire itself, coming into existence from the severed flesh of Uranus, cast into the waves. Aphrodite was so beautiful that when the other gods saw her for the first time, they were struck with longing. She had the power to inspire passion, to make mortals and gods alike desire her with an overwhelming force, to bind hearts and wills to her own through the sheer force of her presence. Her presence was magnetic in the truest sense, drawing everything around her into her orbit. When she walked, flowers bloomed beneath her feet. Men could not resist her, and she knew it. She gloried in her power over desire and love. Though she smiled often and seemed cheerful, it was never without consequence, never without leaving some mark on those who encountered her. Aphrodite gave Pandora her greatest gift, and perhaps her greatest curse: irresistible charm and beauty. She crowned her with grace, with the ability to captivate through sheer presence, through the power of attraction that worked on an almost instinctual level. Aphrodite's gift was not merely physical beauty, though that was certainly part of it. It was a kind of magnetic appeal, a charisma that drew others to her, that made them want to be near her, that made them believe what she told them and do what she asked. But the Graces also came. 3 goddesses known as the Carites: Aglaia, the splendor; Thalia, the joy; and Euphrosyne, the cheer. They represented grace in both senses of the word: the physical grace of movement, the way a body moves through space with elegance and fluidity, and also the divine grace of favor and blessing, the gift of being liked and admired. They adorned Pandora further, placing golden necklaces upon her, ensuring that every ornament she wore seemed to enhance rather than encumber her, that everything about her appearance seemed just right. They ensured that she bore herself with elegance and poise, that every movement she made would be graceful, that every gesture would seem natural and beautiful, as though choreographed by artists. Every action she took would be beautiful to watch. Every moment of her existence would be a kind of performance. And finally, Zeus himself gave her 2 crucial gifts. 2 gifts that were perhaps the most important of all. The first was the very thing that would ensure her downfall, that would make her the instrument of revenge, the trigger that would unleash catastrophe. He gave her curiosity, that irresistible urge to know what was hidden, to discover what lay beyond the boundary of the permitted, to ask questions and seek answers. Curiosity is not an evil in itself, not really. It is the root of all learning, of all scientific discovery, of all human progress. It is the force that drives people to explore, to investigate, to push past the comfortable and familiar into the unknown. But it can also be dangerous. It can lead one to transgress boundaries that exist for good reason. It can drive one to open doors that were meant to remain closed. It can make one break rules that were established to protect something precious. The second gift from Zeus was the jar itself, an ornate vessel of pottery, sealed carefully with a lid that seemed impossible to open, placed into her hands with stern warning. And Zeus made sure she understood the warning. He told her, clearly and directly, "Never open this. Do not look inside. Keep it sealed always and sealed forever. Whatever you do, do not let curiosity overcome restraint. Do not let your desire to know overcome your obedience, for if you open it, if you lift that lid and look inside, terrible consequences will follow. There will be suffering beyond measure. There will be pain and sorrow for all time. This is not a suggestion. This is not a command to be taken lightly. This is absolute law, sealed by my authority and by the authority of all the gods. Do not open the jar. And so Pandora was complete. Her name, which means all gifted, was chosen specifically because all the gods had given her gifts, had contributed something to her making. She was the most perfect creation, a being fashioned with care by the divine and containing within her form qualities drawn from the greatest of the immortals. She was a masterpiece, a work of art brought to life. Yet everything about her, her beauty, her charm, her curiosity, her cleverness, her eloquence, her grace, was designed specifically to be a trap. She was, in the ancient Greek term, a kalon kakon, a beautiful evil, a curse wrapped in perfection. She was a weapon designed and crafted with divine precision to bring about the downfall of mankind. And in her hands she carried a jar sealed with the expectation that it would one day be opened, and when it was, the world would never be the same. What was contained within that jar? Hesiod does not give us a precise and complete inventory. He speaks in general terms of countless plagues and evils that would escape. And later writers and interpreters throughout the centuries have filled in the details through their own readings of the myth, their own understanding of what constitutes human suffering. But what emerges from ancient accounts is a catalogue, a kind of taxonomy of all the suffering that would henceforth afflict humanity. There was sickness, actual illness, disease, plague, the maladies that rack the body and weaken it. Before Pandora opened the jar, humans did not sicken in the way we understand it. They did not fall ill and recover. They did not experience the fever and the chills, the pain that racked their limbs, the slow weakening as disease ran its course through their bodies. There was aging too, what the Greeks called geras, the gradual weakening of the body over time, the loss of strength and beauty and capability. Before, humans did not age in the way we understand it now. They simply existed for a certain span of time and then died gently, without decay, without the long, slow diminishment of physical power, without the horror of watching one's own body betray you piece by piece. But when aging escaped from the jar, when that spirit fled into the world, it changed everything. The body would weaken with each passing year. The joints would grow stiff. The hair would grey and thin. The skin would wrinkle and become papery. Strength would fade. The vigour of youth would slip away. What had been a swift transition from life to a gentle death became a long, slow decline into infirmity, a process in which one could watch oneself deteriorate, could feel capabilities diminishing. There was death itself, and this is crucial to understand, for death existed before the jar was opened, but it was not the sting it would become. Before, death came gently, without pain or fear. It was like sleep, like fading into a pleasant dream from which one simply did not wake. But once the jar was opened, once that spirit fled, death became something to dread. It became a thief in the night, a terror that stalked the living, a constant presence at the edge of awareness, reminding mortals of their finitude and powerlessness. The ancient Greeks had a concept of a spirit or demon called Thanatos, the personification of death, and it was perhaps he who escaped from the jar, bringing with him not the fact of death, but the fear of it, the knowledge of it, the gnawing awareness that life was temporary and fleeting. There was pain, physical pain, the sensation of suffering that accompanied injury or illness. There was sorrow, that deep emotional ache that came with loss, that heavy weight in the chest. There was grief, the prolonged mourning that followed tragedy, the inability to move forward because the past held you so firmly. There was toil and labor. Suddenly, what had been effortless became difficult. The earth, which had given forth its bounty freely in the Golden Age, would no longer do so. Men would have to work for their food, laboring from dawn to dusk, plowing fields and planting seeds, dealing with drought and pest and disease. Their labor would be endless and exhausting. There would always be more to do, always something that needed to be done. There was strife, conflict, argument, the tendency of men to disagree and clash and fight one another. There was envy, that gnawing desire to have what another possessed, the resentment that arose when one saw another with more or better. There was greed, the endless hunger for more and more, the inability to be satisfied. There was madness, the loss of reason, the breaking of the mind. There was cowardice, the inability to face danger without being overwhelmed by fear. There was shame, the painful awareness of having done wrong or fallen short of expectations. There was despair, the belief that things would never improve, that suffering would never end. All of these things, and countless others, were contained within that jar. But here is where we encounter one of the great puzzles of the myth, one of the questions that has troubled philosophers and scholars for 2,500 years. Why would such evil things be kept in a sealed vessel? If Zeus wanted to punish mankind by exposing them to disease and suffering, why seal them inside a jar? Why create the possibility that the jar might be opened? Why make it a test of obedience rather than simply releasing the evils directly? Some scholars have suggested that the jar itself served as a kind of containment, that these evils were somehow neutralized or limited while imprisoned within it, and their escape meant they were unleashed in their full power upon the world. Others have suggested that the jar represents the fragile nature of human happiness, that humans exist in a kind of sealed container of temporary peace, and one moment of transgression, one act of boundary crossing, one moment of disobedience can shatter that peace forever. Still others have proposed that the myth is not about the jar containing evils, but about the release of blessings, that before the jar was opened, mankind possessed gifts and good things, and Pandora's act of opening it scattered them away to the gods, leaving humans bereft, left only with what remained behind. But the most straightforward interpretation, and the one that Hesiod himself seems to present, is that the jar contained a collection of misfortunes that had been deliberately assembled by Zeus, a punishment specifically designed and carefully packaged, waiting for the moment when it would be triggered. The jar was not a prison from which the contents could escape on their own. It required an act of deliberate transgression. It required someone to disobey the specific command that had been given. It required an act of will, a choice, a moment when the boundary was consciously crossed. Hermes, the swift-footed messenger of the gods, the divine herald who moved between worlds, brought Pandora to Epimetheus. Now, the stories vary slightly in the details, and different versions give different accounts of exactly when this happened and under what circumstances. Some accounts say that Prometheus had already been taken and chained to his mountain of torment by this point, and Epimetheus was alone. Others suggest that Prometheus was present and witnessed the arrival of this mysterious woman, and still others say that Prometheus had given specific warning to Epimetheus about accepting gifts. but all accounts agree on the essential fact. Epimetheus saw Pandora and was captivated. She was perfection incarnate. Every god had contributed their finest gifts. Her beauty was not merely physical beauty. Anyone can sculpt an attractive form. Anyone with some artistic sensibility can create something that is pleasing to the eye. Her beauty was the kind that transcended mere appearance. It was a beauty that seemed to contain within it intelligence and grace and kindness and all manner of virtue. When she moved with such elegance that it seemed choreographed, as though she were dancing to music no one else could hear. When she spoke, her voice was like honey, like music, like the song of birds at dawn. It was impossible not to be drawn to her. It was impossible not to feel the pull of attraction, the desire to be near her, the longing that she inspired. Everything about her seemed designed to captivate, to enchant, to make one forget that anything else existed in the world besides her presence. Epimetheus, lacking foresight, did not think to himself, "This is a gift from Zeus, whom I have wronged. Zeus has sent me this beautiful woman as a test, and I must refuse her. Therefore, I must refuse it." He did not weigh the danger or consider the consequences. He did not think ahead to what accepting this gift might mean, what it might unleash, what the repercussions might be. He simply saw beauty and desired it. He saw companionship offered and felt loneliness vanish. He saw the possibility of companionship, of having someone to share his life with, and he wanted it desperately. The stories tell us that Prometheus had warned him. There are references in various versions to Prometheus having cautioned Epimetheus against accepting gifts from the gods. But these warnings seem not to have been reinforced when the moment came. Or perhaps Epimetheus heard them and agreed at that moment, thinking in theory that he would refuse anything Zeus might send. But theory and reality are different things. Understanding something in the abstract and acting on it in the concrete moment are not the same. When confronted with actual living beauty, when looking into Pandora's eyes, when hearing her voice, Epimetheus's good intentions evaporated like dew in the morning sun. And so Epimetheus took Pandora. He brought her into his home. He took her as his wife. Some versions of the myth speak of a formal wedding, with all the rituals and ceremonies that Greek marriage entailed. Others speak more simply of him taking her into his household, of them beginning to live together. But the point is the same. Pandora was no longer an abstract creation of the gods, no longer a theoretical threat. She had become a real presence in the mortal world, living among humans, one of them in the way that mattered most. She walked the earth, she breathed the air, she lived in the world and was no longer separated from it by the distance between Olympus and earth. And with her came the jar, this beautiful sealed vessel that sat in the household, its contents locked away, its purpose mysterious. Pandora must have wondered about it. After all, Zeus had given it to her with stern warnings. Her creators had given her the very gift of curiosity, that burning urge to know, that desire to understand. And now this sealed object sat before her, mysterious and forbidden. What was inside? Why was it forbidden? Why had Zeus been so emphatic about the warning not to open it? Why was it so important that the jar remain sealed? These questions must have begun to form in Pandora's mind, and she had been created with curiosity, that burning need to know, that urge to understand, that drive to cross boundaries and discover what lies beyond them. Days became weeks, and weeks became months, perhaps even longer. For some time, perhaps, Pandora resisted the urge to open it. The early days were filled with the normal life of a newly married couple. Epimetheus presumably felt joy and satisfaction at having such a beautiful wife. Pandora went about her duties. She worked wool and made cloth, using the skill that Athena had given her. She managed the household, using the practical wisdom that had been instilled in her. She lived with her husband in what we might imagine was contentment, or at least the appearance of it. The routine of daily life occupied her. There was work to be done. There were tasks that required attention. There was the pleasure of a new marriage, the intimacy and companionship of a shared life. But the jar was always there. It sat in the corner or on a shelf, ornate and beautiful in itself, crafted with care and skill, but mysterious and sealed. It occupied a place in the household, a physical presence that could not be ignored. What was inside? Why was it forbidden? Why had Zeus been so emphatic about the warning not to open it? The longer the jar sat sealed, the more it seemed to call to her. Every time she passed it, every time she glimpsed it from the corner of her eye, the urge grew stronger. It's not hard to imagine the process of temptation, the slow erosion of resistance. Perhaps I could just open it slightly, she might have thought. Surely just looking wouldn't hurt anyone. The warning said not to open it, but surely that means I shouldn't let the contents out. Surely I could open it just enough to see what's inside, and then quickly close it again. These are the thoughts that come to those who are tempted by the forbidden, the whispers of rationalization that lead to transgression. These are the ways that the human mind works, justifying what it wants to do, finding reasons to believe that transgression is acceptable, that the rules don't really apply in this particular case, that surely there's a way to do the forbidden thing without suffering the consequences. And then came the moment when resistance finally shattered. Whether it was a morning when she woke and could no longer bear the weight of not knowing, or an afternoon when curiosity finally overcame restraint, or a night when she could no longer sleep for thinking about what lay sealed within the jar, we cannot say. Hesiod does not give us the details of her mental state or her reasoning. He simply tells us, Pandora opened the jar. He does not say how long she resisted. He does not say what finally broke her will. He simply states the fact boldly, directly. She opened it. This is the crucial moment, the instant that would change everything. The moment the seal was broken, the moment the lid was lifted, something terrible was released. Imagine the sound. Perhaps a sound like wind or like breath exhaling. A sound like the escape of something that had been under pressure for a very long time. Perhaps a whistling sound, a rushing sound, something that suggested power and danger. Imagine the sight, perhaps a kind of mist or smoke beginning to emerge, or perhaps figures taking shape and form, visible spirits of plague and pestilence beginning to make their escape, rising up like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for ages. These were not abstract concepts, but actual entities, demons or spirits or personifications of the evils that had been sealed within. The carers, sometimes described as spirits of violent death or misfortune, sometimes as the female spirits who attended at deathbeds and battlefields, began to escape. With them came the Erinyes, the Furies, spirits of vengeance and misery, those terrible beings who pursued oath-breakers and kinslayers. Nosos, disease itself, took form and flew outward, becoming real and present in the world. Geras, old age, spread its cold and weakening touch. Death, no longer the gentle release it had been, became a stalker and a terror. Pain and suffering and every manner of woe that the ancient world could imagine poured forth. It was not a gradual seeping, but an explosive release, as though something that had been compressed and contained under immense pressure had suddenly found a way out and could not be stopped. And they did not simply remain where the jar was opened. They spread. They dissipated into the world like water spreading across parched earth. They floated on the wind. They seeped into the soil. They entered the bodies of mortals and the air that mortals breathed. What had been contained and limited suddenly became everywhere at once. The earth, which had been full of green growing things and plenty, was suddenly full of evils. The sea, which had been a highway for trade and travel, was suddenly full of dangers and sorrows. Every place that humans might go, every breath they might draw, every moment of their existence, was suddenly tainted with the consequences of that single moment of transgression. And the people, the mortals who had lived in their golden age, who had never known sickness or age or pain or fear, suddenly found all of these things descending upon them. It must have been terrifying beyond measure. One day, life was as it had always been, easy and effortless and free from suffering. The next day, the world had changed fundamentally. Bodies that had never known pain suddenly ached. Skin that had never known disease suddenly erupted in sores. The strength that had always been present began to fade. The ease of living began to give way to difficulty. And most terrifying of all was the knowledge that this would never end, that this was the new condition of human existence, that from this moment forward, until the end of time, humanity would live with these afflictions. But then something unexpected happened, or perhaps it was expected, depending on one's interpretation of Zeus's plans. As the evils poured forth, as they escaped into the world like a plague of locusts devouring everything in their path, there was one thing that did not fly away. There was one entity that remained in the jar, clinging to the interior as though afraid to leave, or held back by some invisible force. That entity was Elpis, hope. The Greek word Elpis is difficult to translate precisely into English. We translate it as hope, and that is not wrong, but it captures only part of the meaning. Elpis can also mean expectation or anticipation, a looking forward to what might come, a belief that the future could be different from the present. It is a sense of possible better things to come. But in ancient Greek thought, Elpis had a somewhat different flavor than our modern concept of hope, where we tend to think of hope as universally positive, as something that enables us to endure and overcome, as something purely good and useful. The ancient Greeks had a more complex and ambiguous view of it. Consider the situation. If all the evils of the world have been released, if disease and suffering and death are now loose upon the earth, if the conditions of life have changed forever, what good does hope do? If hope allows mortals to believe that things will get better, but they won't, if that belief is false, if it merely prolongs suffering by creating expectations that will never be fulfilled, then is hope good or evil? Is it a blessing or another curse? Is it something that sustains humanity through darkness? Or is it something that deceives humanity and keeps them from accepting reality? Hesiod's own account is maddeningly ambiguous. He tells us that Pandora put the lid back in time by the will of Zeus, and that hope remained inside the jar. But he doesn't tell us whether this was intentional or accidental, whether it was merciful or cruel, whether hope remained because it was good and needed to be preserved, or whether it remained because it was another evil that Zeus wanted to keep trapped, where it could not help anyone. Different interpreters have proposed different answers over the centuries. Some have read the myth pessimistically, suggesting that hope is indeed an evil, perhaps the worst evil of all. This interpretation suggests that what makes human suffering truly unbearable is not the suffering itself, but the false belief that things might improve, that someday the pain will end, that there might be better days ahead. This false hope, this expectation that things will get better when they won't, keeps mortals trapped in a state of perpetual yearning and disappointment. Instead of accepting their fate and adapting to it, they continue to long for something better, to believe in a future that will never come. They continue to struggle and strive when they should perhaps accept and endure. Without hope, they might collapse into despair, yes, but at least they would not suffer the additional pain of expecting relief that never comes. Without hope, they might find a kind of peace in acceptance. With hope, they are forever tormented by the gap between what they have and what they believe they might have. Others have interpreted the myth more optimistically. In this reading, hope is indeed a good thing, and Zeus allowed it to remain inside the jar precisely as a mercy to mankind. Trapped in the jar, hope is something that can be accessed, something that humans can draw upon when they need it most. It is not distributed throughout the world like the other evils, diluted and weakened, but preserved intact, so that when mortals reach their lowest points, when they feel that they cannot endure another moment, they can still find hope and draw strength from it. Even in the darkness of suffering, they can access hope and find the strength to continue, to believe that somehow things might get better, to keep going. In this interpretation, hope is the one bright light in a dark world, the one counterbalance to all the suffering, the one thing that keeps humanity from giving up entirely. There is even a third interpretation, suggested by some ancient sources, that the contents of the jar were not evils at all, but good things, blessings from the gods, gifts that were meant to be distributed to mankind, things like prosperity and joy and good fortune. In this version, before the opening of the jar, humans had possessed not just freedom from suffering, but active goods and blessings. These were scattered and lost when Pandora opened the jar, leaving humanity bereft. Hope, in this reading, would have been included in the jar as one of these good things, preserved as a reminder that such blessings had once existed and might one day be recovered. Nietzsche, the German philosopher who wrote centuries after the height of ancient Greek civilization, had his own interpretation. He read hope itself as evil, the most pernicious evil in the jar, suggesting that it is precisely the human ability to hope that perpetuates suffering. Without hope, he argued, despair might give way to a kind of acceptance or even peace. But with hope, humans are condemned to an endless cycle of desire and disappointment, forever reaching for something just beyond their grasp, forever believing that things could be different, forever suffering because reality never matches expectation. The very thing that we call hope, Nietzsche suggested, is the thing that keeps us chained to suffering. But regardless of how one interprets the nature of hope, its role in the myth is undeniable. It is the counterweight to all the other evils. It is the one thing that prevents complete despair. Whether hope is good or evil, necessary or cruel, it is the thin thread by which humanity remains connected to the possibility of a better tomorrow. What did the opening of Pandora's jar mean for humanity? It meant the end of the Golden Age, the end of paradise, the end of easy existence. It meant that the easy life that had defined human existence up until that moment was gone forever. Before the opening of the jar, humans had lived without toil. Now toil became the defining feature of human existence. Men would have to work to survive, laboring from dawn to dusk, plowing fields and planting crops, building shelters and fashioning tools. Women would have to work too, spinning and weaving, bearing children with labor and pain that Prometheus had not foreseen, managing households with ceaseless effort. The work would never be finished. There would always be something more to do, something that needed to be done. The earth would not give forth its bounty freely anymore. It would have to be forced to yield its fruits through hard labor. Before the opening of the jar, humans had not aged. They had lived their spans and died gently, without pain or diminishment. Now aging became the great terror of human existence. Humans could watch themselves weaken over time. They could feel their strength fade, their speed diminish, their ability to do the things they had once done so effortlessly slip away. Wrinkles would appear on their faces. Hair would grey, bones would grow brittle, teeth would loosen and fall. The slow corruption of the body through time would become something every human would experience, a process of deterioration that was inevitable and unstoppable. Most significantly, death had been transformed. Before, it was gentle and painless. Now, it was terrifying. Now it was something to dread, something that came suddenly and stole away the living, something that could strike down the young and healthy without warning. Now humans had to live with the knowledge that they would die, that everyone they loved would die, that all their efforts and accomplishments would eventually be rendered meaningless by death. This knowledge, this awareness of mortality, this gnawing anxiety about finitude became one of the defining features of the human experience. Sickness came. Humans experienced fever and ache, wounds that festered and became infected, sickness that wasted away the body. Plague descended on cities and villages, killing indiscriminately, striking down the just and the unjust alike. Hunger came. The earth, which had once given forth its bounty freely, now yielded only grudgingly and only in response to hard work. If the work was not done, if the seasons turned wrong, if blight or pest struck the crops, then hunger and starvation would come. Children would cry from empty bellies. Families would suffer. Some would die. War came. Where humans had once lived in peace and harmony, now they began to fight one another. Strife arose between men over property and honor and grievance. Warfare became a constant feature of human life. Entire civilizations would rise and fall. Vast armies would clash. Countless warriors would die on battlefields far from home. Widows would keen over their dead sons and husbands. The social fabric began to fray. Bonds that had been strong and reliable became fragile. Parents lost faith in children, and children grew distant from parents. Guests were no longer automatically welcomed and protected, but were viewed with suspicion. The customs and laws that held society together had to be consciously created and maintained, rather than flowing naturally from the harmony that had once existed. Emotionally, humans now experienced a range of suffering they had never known. There was sorrow, the deep pain that came with loss. There was grief, the prolonged mourning that followed tragedy. There was fear, the constant awareness that bad things could happen at any moment. There was shame and regret. There was jealousy and envy. There was the slow, gnawing sadness that came from the awareness that the world was not as good as it could be, and that there was not much any individual could do about it. there was the horror of watching loved ones suffer and being powerless to help them. In short, humanity had been transformed from a race of gods living in paradise to a race of struggling mortals, burdened by the weight of existence, defined by suffering and toil, and the constant awareness of finitude. But Pandora's jar was only part of Zeus's response to Prometheus's defiance. The god could not let the theft of fire stand without direct punishment. The god could not allow such rebellion to go unpunished, or it would set a precedent, would suggest that he could be defied, and that defiance would go without consequence. And so Prometheus was captured and brought before Zeus for judgment. What occurred was not a trial in any sense that would recognize justice or fair process. It was simple, brutal punishment. Zeus had decided what Prometheus's fate would be, and he would carry it out. Prometheus was taken to the Caucasus Mountains, that great range at the edge of the known world, those peaks where the earth reached up toward the sky. There, he was bound to a rock or pillar with chains forged by Hephaestus himself, chains of adamantine, unbreakable and eternal. He was chained in such a way that he could not move, could not escape, bound in place for all eternity. The chains were unbreakable, forged from a material that existed only in the divine realm, a metal that no force in the world could snap or weaken. And then Zeus sent an eagle. Some say it was the eagle that would later become the emblem of Zeus's power. Others claim it was a Kroitende, creature born of the monster Typhon, to torture the Titan. Each day, the eagle would descend and feast upon Prometheus's liver, tearing it from his body with beak and claw. The pain must have been exquisite, unimaginable suffering beyond what any mortal could endure. The liver was thought by the ancient Greeks to be the seat of human emotion, the source of passion and feeling, and to have it torn apart daily would be the ultimate torment. Imagine the sensation, the agony, the violation of it. But here was the cruel irony. Prometheus could not die. He was immortal, and his flesh, though damaged and torn, would regenerate each night. The liver would grow back, whole and intact, as though the day's torture had never happened. And the next day, the eagle would return and do it all again. This would continue, day after day, night after night, year after year, century after century, with no end in sight. The process would become eternal and unstoppable. Imagine the mental torment that would accompany the physical pain. Imagine knowing that this was your fate, that you had been condemned to eternal torture, that no rescue would come, that no end would ever arrive unless someone could convince Zeus to release you. Imagine the despair that would come with full knowledge of one's fate, the absolute certainty that tomorrow would bring the same agony, and the day after that, and on forever. How could one maintain sanity under such circumstances? How could one keep hope alive? Yet Prometheus endured, and he endured precisely because of the secret knowledge he possessed. He knew that Zeus could not simply kill him, because Zeus needed something from him. He knew that eventually the king of the gods would have to come and ask him about the woman who would bear the son destined to overthrow him. And that day of reckoning would be when Prometheus would have his leverage, his power, his way to negotiate for his freedom. But that day was far in the future. For now, he hung chained to the mountainside while the eagle fed on his immortal flesh. For now, he could only wait and endure, knowing that his sacrifice had at least granted mankind the gift of fire, the beginning of civilization, the spark that would allow humans to rise above the level of beasts. If we understand Pandora's box as a myth told to explain why suffering exists in the world, a theodicy, an attempt to justify the ways of the gods to mortals, then we must also grapple with the troubling implications of how the myth chooses to convey that explanation. Because the myth places responsibility for all human suffering squarely on the shoulders of a woman. It is Pandora's curiosity that causes the catastrophe. It is Pandora's inability to resist temptation that unleashes the evils of the world. The implication, not subtle in ancient Greek society, was that women were responsible for the ills that plagued humanity. Women, with their insatiable curiosity and their inability to obey even simple commands, had doomed the human race. This is deeply misogynistic, and modern scholars have not shied away from pointing it out. Hesiod himself, in the Works and Days, makes his attitude clear. He writes about Pandora and the race of women that comes from her, and he says, "From her is the race of women and female kind. Of her is the deadly race and tribe of women who live amongst mortal men, to their great trouble. No helpmeets in hateful poverty, but only in wealth." In other words, women are a burden, a curse, useful only when there is wealth to support them, but a liability in times of hardship. The very existence of women is presented as a punishment for men, doled out by Zeus for Prometheus's transgression. The first woman is a plague upon mankind, and all the women who descend from her carry that same plague, that same curse with them. This misogyny was not accidental. It was woven into the fabric of ancient Greek society. Women had few legal rights. They were subject to the authority of male relatives throughout their lives, fathers, brothers, husbands, and eventually sons. They could not own property or vote or participate in public life. Their role was understood to be limited to the household and reproduction. They were supposed to be silent and obedient, to work hard at their designated tasks, and to cause no trouble. And in the myth of Pandora, there is a clear message. This limited role is not incidental to women's nature. It is not just the way society has chosen to organize itself. It is punishment for the transgression of the first woman. It is the natural and appropriate consequence of female curiosity and disobedience. Yet, stepping back from the specific misogyny of the myth, there is a deeper truth that it's trying to convey. It's trying to explain why humans, unique among all creatures, are burdened with the knowledge of their own mortality and the ability to imagine futures that might never come to pass. Humans, unlike animals, can conceive of a world different from the one they inhabit. They can imagine better circumstances. They can dream of possibilities. And this ability to imagine, this capacity for hope and for fear about the future, is both a gift and a curse. It elevates humanity above the level of beasts, but it also condemns humans to a particular kind of suffering that no other creature experiences: existential suffering. The suffering that comes from the awareness of limitation and finitude. Curiosity, in the myth, represents the human drive to know, to understand, to push past imposed limits and boundaries. It is, in a sense, the drive toward knowledge and enlightenment, and yet the myth presents it as a liability, as the source of transgression. This reflects a real tension in ancient Greek thought between the value of knowledge and the dangers that knowledge can bring. The Greeks understood that there were some things that should remain unknown, some boundaries that should not be crossed. They understood that knowledge can bring suffering as well as benefit. "It is better not to know" was a sentiment that appears again and again in Greek literature The myth of Oedipus, for instance, centers on a man who relentlessly pursues knowledge of his true identity, and this knowledge destroys him utterly. The myth of Pandora's box suggests something similar. There are things better left unknown, doors better left unopened, mysteries better left mysterious. To satisfy one's curiosity might seem natural and even noble, but it can have catastrophic consequences. Yet the myth also suggests that this knowledge-seeking is somehow inevitable. Pandora was created with curiosity as one of her fundamental traits. She could not be otherwise. She was made with the urge to know, and so her transgression was in a sense predetermined. This raises profound questions about agency and responsibility. Is Pandora culpable for opening the jar when she was created, with the very curiosity that led her to do so? Is she exercising free will when she acts according to her nature? Or is she simply the instrument through which Zeus's plan unfolds? Is she a victim of her own nature? Or is she responsible for her choices? These are questions that have troubled philosophers for centuries, and the myth does not provide clear answers. Millennia have passed since Hesiod wrote down the myth of Pandora's box. Civilizations have risen and fallen. Technologies have transformed human life beyond recognition, and yet the story persists. It is retold and reinterpreted, analyzed and debated, referenced in popular culture, and discussed in academic settings. Why does this myth endure when so many others have faded into obscurity? Why do we keep returning to this story? Part of the reason is that it speaks to something fundamental about the human condition. It attempts to answer one of the oldest and most troubling questions. Why does suffering exist? If the universe was created by gods or by God, if there is some fundamental order or justice to existence, why do innocents suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there pain and disease and death? The Pandora myth provides an answer to this question, albeit one that modern sensibilities find troubling. It says, suffering exists because of a transgression. Someone broke a rule, violated a boundary, and as a consequence, suffering was unleashed. In one sense, this is deeply unfair. The perpetrators of the transgression, well, Prometheus was the primary agent, though Epimetheus shares some blame, and then Pandora bears the responsibility in how Zeus frames it, actually suffered less in some ways than the innocent parties, all of humanity. Prometheus was eventually freed by Heracles, but humanity has been burdened with suffering ever since, and many individual humans will die never knowing why they suffer, never understanding what they did to deserve such pain. Yet there is also a kind of justice in it, from a certain point of view. The transgression was understood to be a violation of the social order, a defiance of the natural hierarchy of gods and mortals. That hierarchy had to be maintained, and the breakdown of it had to be punished. Moreover, there is an implicit argument that the punishment serves a purpose. Mankind did receive the gift of fire, the gift of knowledge, the gifts that allowed civilization to develop. They were not left completely helpless. They had been elevated above the level of beasts. They were given the potential to become more than they would have been. But that elevation came at a cost. To be human, to be capable of knowledge and art and civilization, is to be burdened with the awareness of finitude and suffering. The myth also speaks to the particular burden of knowledge. The ancient Greeks, with their emphasis on knowledge as the root of virtue, understood that knowledge and ignorance each have their prices. Ignorance brings a kind of peace and freedom from certain anxieties, but it also brings powerlessness and vulnerability. Knowledge brings power and the ability to make informed decisions, but it also brings burden and responsibility, and the awareness of dangers and limitations. In the modern world, we continue to grapple with the consequences of Prometheus's theft of fire, metaphorically speaking. Fire was not just literal fire. It represented technology, knowledge, civilization, and every major technology has brought both benefits and dangers. Nuclear power gave us an almost unlimited source of energy and also the ability to destroy civilization entirely. The internet connected us globally and also opened us to surveillance and misinformation. Genetic engineering gives us the ability to cure diseases and also to create horrors. Fire remains a fitting metaphor because it burns with both warmth and destruction. The myth of Pandora's box, in the end, is about the fundamental trade-off of human existence. It is about gaining power and paying the price for that power. It is about acquiring knowledge and suffering the consequences of knowledge. It is about becoming human, reaching for something more, striving, creating, building civilization, and discovering that the price is suffering. But it is also about hope, that strange and ambiguous thing that remains in the jar. Even in a world that contains all of these evils, hope remains. And whether hope is a blessing or a curse, whether it sustains us or deceives us, it is what makes human existence possible. Without hope, we would be unable to endure. With hope, we continue, even knowing that suffering awaits us. We continue to strive, to build, to love, to create. We continue to live. This is the story of Pandora's box, a story about curiosity and consequence, about the price of knowledge, about how a single moment of transgression can reshape the entire world. It is a story that has endured because it speaks to something true about human nature, about our endless struggle with desire and restraint, about our yearning to know more, to have more, to be more. And it is a story that reminds us that even in the midst of suffering, even when we have opened the box and unleashed catastrophe, even when we are surrounded by pain and sorrow and loss, hope remains. That fragile, ambiguous hope remains inside the jar, waiting to be found by those who seek it, ready to sustain us through the darkness.